So very excited to welcome you all to this MESH webinar on community engagement at a distance. I'm Robin Vincent. I'm going to be facilitating the event today overall. And I'd also like to introduce Helena Wilcox from the Global Health Network, who's going to be our producer, dealing with some of the mechanics of the day. And she's your point of contact if you have any technical issues with the connection. I'll introduce some of our other facilitators and presenters as we go, but want to quickly give you a brief overview of how we're going to do the meeting today. So the meeting is going to be broadly in two parts today, really. The first session is going to be looking at designing and facilitating virtual events and give you a chance to really get a hands-on feel for making an online meeting a little bit more interactive and participatory. And then the second session, we're actually going to hear from a number of different experiences around engaging at a distance, quite varied, quite rich experiences. So we're going to have a chance to sort of look at the learning from those experiences, which will be great. And in between, we'll have a break, because you always need a break on these online meetings. They can be quite intense. We'll be sneaking some videos in there as well, but making sure that you get a good rest as well. One of the things I should say about the meeting, there's a lot of us here. It's very exciting to have so many people assembled. We'll cover a lot, but also we can never cover everything. So one of the good things is that after the meeting, we'll be gathering resources on the MESH website, and we'll be able to carry on the discussion there, but we'll also be adding quite a lot of materials that come out of the meeting today and that some of our presenters have prepared. So I invite you all to sort of check out that space on MESH, and I'll remind you about that also towards the end. And before diving into the sessions, when you were invited, when you registered for the meeting, you were invited to look at a challenge question about sort of engagement at a distance. You know, what challenges does this throw up in your opinion? And we're actually going to try and touch on some of these challenges in the presenters' presentations as we go through, but also help them to sort of guide our conversation. And just to briefly touch on them now, one of the main challenges was around access to the internet and the technology, but also the skills needed to make that work effectively. Other main challenges were finding a way to build rapport with a new group when you haven't met them already face to face. It's sometimes harder to do that in the online environment. We'll be hearing a good deal about that from Orla. Building trust and relationships over time. How can you build the sort of kind of relationship that you can usually build when you've had some successive face-to-face meetings? The issue of kind of diversity of involvement, hearing those unheard voices, is another key challenge that's always there. And actually getting meaningful community feedback is something that's also very important. So we will try and touch on those issues as we go through the meeting, and they can also be useful to sort of guide the discussion as we go. We hope to get input from you as far as we can throughout the meeting, and particularly over the next two sessions. So without any further hesitation, I'm very, very pleased to hand over in session one to Orla Cronin. She's a very experienced trainer and facilitator and a research psychologist who's many years of experience in virtual facilitation, making sure that events online are as participatory as possible. So I'm very glad to hand over to her for our first session.
Thank you very much, Rob, and I'm really delighted to be here and thrilled to see how many of you are have arrived and in such good time as well. We've got a bit of a roller coaster for the next 40 minutes with some interactivity as well, so watch out for any yellow boxes which will ask you to do something. I noticed in the chat that a couple of you are still having some problems with tech, so just wanted to remind you, I won't go through this in detail, but just I wanted to remind you that you do have a self-test button which actually also does some problem solving. So do please keep in touch with us by chat if you have any further technical challenges. So I'm going to be talking to you about designing and facilitating virtual events and trying to talk about how to bring the whole person into the room. But I will also be addressing some of the challenges that you came up with, which is around how to create that deep connection. And I'm sorry, I may have also misguided everybody because we may not be all using cameras initially. I'll leave that to Helena to resolve. A few little tricks which will serve you for the rest of the day. I know that we've all been working in Zoom for days on end, it might seem, for the past 6 months, but just in case you're familiar with a different platform, I just want to remind you that when you have been given audio rights, when you're in your breakouts, you can use, you can turn your microphone on and off using the unmute button. You can turn your camera on and off using the webcam, of course, but really importantly, you can use the participant list to communicate with us. It gives you a whole series of icons that we would like you to use if possible. We might ask you at some points to do yes and no's, for example, or give us a thumbs up. So do please use the participant list. Also tell us if you're stepping away. It's really useful if we're preparing breakouts, as Helena is probably doing right now. It's really useful to know if somebody is out of the system. And then, of course, you know about chat, and please use the chat. If that serves you, if you like to multitask in these sessions, then use the chat. Throw in questions, we'll answer them afterwards, or at some point we will answer your questions. So feel free to engage that way if that helps to keep you interested. Private chat may or may not be enabled, I'm not sure yet. And so that's just to deepen your understanding of these response buttons. One thing that's useful in terms of managing your own attention is just customizing the space so that you can see everything you want to see. You can choose side-by-side mode from the view options. You'll have at the top of your screen a little view options button, and you can choose side-by-side mode so that you can see both who's speaking and the slides they're presenting, which often it makes it more personal. And you can also toggle speaker view and gallery view. When you're in breakouts, you may want to have gallery view, again, the top right hand side of most of your screens, so that you can see everybody who's there. So that's just a quick gallop through things you probably already know. And now let's go over to you. I know some of you have been engaging in the chat and telling us where you are. I'm hoping that annotation has been enabled for all of you. So either go to the view options menu, pull down that menu and choose annotate. And then just give us a mark, a scribble to show us where you're based. If that isn't enabled, yes, we've got somebody coming, so it has been enabled, yes. So you might want to give us a stamp or an X or a heart or whatever you like to tell us where you're based. You've got lots of people clustered in Northwest Europe. But we've got, wonderful, we've got somebody all the way down in South Africa, heading into spring at the moment, I guess, whoever's in South Africa. Lots of people in Southeast Asia. How lovely. And another cluster in the west of Europe. Not many people out to the west of us, but I guess it's because it's in the middle of their nights. That's probably understandable. And so greetings to you if you're joining us later, looking at the recording. We missed you, and we hope you get some value out of watching the recording too. And Giovanna has just discovered a really annoying glitch, possibly, is that when you choose that arrow, as soon as somebody else chooses it, it deletes. So that's a slightly annoying glitch with that arrow. Okay, well, I'm going to, you've had a play with Annotate. We will use that again. And I'm going to say now that I won't be watching the chat very much. So I'm going to leave it to Helena and Rob to curate your questions. But if you want to be able to annotate, if you're on a laptop or desktop, you go to the top of the screen where you can see screen is being shared, choose the view options menu, pull that down and you will get the annotate. If you're on a tablet or a phone, usually just poking the screen will give you something to scribble with. So have a play with that later on. Okay, I'm going to invite Helena to clear the annotations because they obviously persist. And what we're going to do now is have a look at one of the challenges that the questions that you asked during your registration. I've been asked to particularly sort of consider how to establish rapport and empathy and connection. I'll speak to that directly during some of this, but actually you folk will have some fantastic ideas of how to do that yourselves. So what I want to do is to use the power and the breadth of the group and the breadth of your experience to address this question together. The way we're going to do that is we are going to put you in breakout groups. You won't need to do anything. You'll land automatically in a breakout group. You'll be in a very small group, probably of between 2 and 4. So you have time to say hello and greet your colleagues. We'll spend approximately 5 minutes doing this, so don't spend too long in your chat. And we're going to ask you to go to a fun retro board. Now, I'm going to stop sharing for a second and show you that board. And Helena, in the meantime, is pasting the link, that link to that fun retro into the chat. So let me just stop the share. I'm just going to make sure I grab the right thing to share with you. So when you click on that fun retro link, it will bring you into this space. And this is a very simple brainstorming tool. We're going to use it a second time later on for questions. The questions you're answering is, how can we create rapport and empathy and connection with a new group? And you add your suggestions like this. If you can't make it work, or if you can't get to the link, perhaps one of your colleagues could add some of your ideas. So I'm going to invite Helena to count us down into the breakouts. We'll keep an eye on the time and bring you back when it's necessary to do, when the time is up. We'll give you a little alert to tell you to start wrapping up. But I'll invite Helena to take us into breakouts when she's ready. Greetings, everybody. I realized that was a very fast and furious little breakout. It was really just to sort of demo how you might get people sort of talking quite early on in a session. Helena's invited everybody to turn off their videos now, if you wish. And I realized that not everybody had managed to pick up the fun retro. But don't worry, everything we do today will be made available to you afterwards. And we'll try and sort of take things a little bit more slowly in future. But what we've got in the fun retro board so far, let me just very briefly project it. I'm not going to debrief it in detail, but what we've illustrated there is a little brainstorming activity. If we wanted to, we could pull together, we could cluster some of these issues together. So for instance, we could take physical activities and warm-up games and put them in the same group, merge them basically so that they come together. So this allows you to do some clustering of ideas. We could also go through and get a few thumbs up to do a voting if we wanted to. And we could also invite you all to comment on each other's questions. So this is just an example of how you can mix the technology and the interaction to do some quite useful work. Basically, what we're trying to do is take some of the practices that we might normally that we might try and do if we were all in a physical space, and do a version of them in an ambitious version of them in a remote space. So that's just a bit of a starter to warm everybody up. I'm just going to rattle through some suggestions and ideas and insights around designing and facilitating virtual events. Excuse me, I'm just going to go in here. The reason I'm here talking to you, Rob has already, I think, introduced me. I'm a research psychologist. I've worked in a number of different environments, but my raison d'etre, my main existence for the last 6 months has been consolidating in the area of virtual facilitation, which is an area I've been working in since 2011, and which I love, and I'm really passionate about it in terms of its opportunity to connect people in new and different ways, and to connect more people than we were ever able to fly around the world to see each other. And the key messages from what I'm speaking to today is to get a great virtual event, be it a workshop or a meeting or a webinar or whatever it is you're trying to do, be really clear about what you're trying to do with the overall event, but also with each section. And then once you're really clear with that aim, be really intentional about your design, and then allow scope for creativity, both in terms of the technology and the kinds of interactions you have. And then underpinning all of that is have a producer and do a rehearsal. Don't try and do it by yourself. have several producers if that's necessary. So I'm going to take each of those messages in turn. Please drop your questions into chat. I won't be able to respond to them live, but I will respond to them afterwards. So the first thing is about aims, and what we tend to do is think about, as facilitators, we think about two kinds of aims. We think about practical aims, which are very much the sort of the very rational sort of technical aims of what we're trying to do. You know, what are the issues? Where do people stand? What insights do we now have? What's the project plan? What's the strategy? They're very heady aims, and that's very often why we're getting together, is to do that. However, just as important, and sometimes maybe the reason why you're meeting, is the experiential aim, how you want the group to feel or be during an event. So what do you want people to experience during the event? How do you want to feel about it afterwards? And we would argue that it's very easy in a remote environment to lose sight of those experiential aims. And that's in some ways where your challenge came from. How do we build that rapport and empathy and connection to achieve that quality of experience that will actually enable us to achieve our practical aims even better and even more smoothly? So be really clear about those. So some examples, and I probably don't need to give too many more examples, but some of the experiential aims are about enabling people to feel safe and listened to, feeling some ownership and commitment to the actions, feeling really connected to the other members of the group. And there are all sorts of facilitative ways that you can do that, both remotely and online. Now, moving back, I'm going to step through those aims in a little bit more detail now. And this is another chance to use your annotate button. So if you're on a laptop or a desktop, at the top of your screen, you will see a green bar, which says you're viewing Orla's screen. If you use the pull down menu beside that, you should reach the annotate tool. And what I'd like you to do is look at this spectrum of involvement and tell us where you tend to be working. So practical aims, sometimes we want to inform people, sometimes we want to consult them, sometimes we really want to deeply involve them, sometimes we're trying to co-create, and sometimes we're trying to empower them. It would be just really interesting to see where your interests are in those different kinds of practical aim. Because for instance, today is probably quite inform-y. I would do something different if I was sitting down with all of you to design an event, for example, if I was collaborating. And so really thinking about which of those you're trying to do will help you start to think about the kinds of tools that are available. And I would argue that you need to get more and more interactive and dynamic as you move through that continuum. So thank you for that. We're seeing lots and lots of stamps, and we can see that people are working all the way across the continuum. So I'm going to invite you to pause your annotation for a moment, and we're going to move on to some experiential. These are examples of practical aims we have in mind when we think about how to achieve them. I'm going to move on to experiential aims. And again, there's lots of different things. You mentioned things like games, you mentioned making time to deeply connect with people. Depending on the kind of experiential aim you might be wanting to do, you may want to have different palettes of activities and technologies to do it. So you might be just wanting to have social engagement. So for example, today, actually, it's a fairly minimal social interaction we're probably looking to do at the moment in terms of experience. But actually, you might be wanting people to behaviorally engage with what you're doing. You might want them to intellectually engage with what you're doing. You might want them to be collaborating with each other, and you might be wanting them to turn up emotionally. And so these, as you can imagine, these cross over with your practical aims, and these using these as frames to look at your event, help you to start narrowing down what kinds of activities and technologies you might be wanting to use. Once you've got your aims established, then you start designing. So you don't go in with a tool and sort of work out how to apply it. Obviously, you start with your aims first, and then you work out what will help you best achieve it in the simplest possible way. Now, people will have lots of different ways that you facilitate, but the way I tend to climb into a design of any kind of event is use focused conversational methodology. Now, focused conversation is a particular tool from a set of tools called Technology of Participation. They're held they're in custody by ICA, which is a charity focused on supporting change in the world by facilitating conversations. And I use this both for my individual conversations within an event, but I also use it for event design. I tend to be looking at what are the facts and details and sensory aspects that people will need to have engaged with. Then what are the emotions and feelings and associations that people will have brought with them or that I might want to evoke in the event? Then what are the possibilities? What are the kind of connections I want people to make? And then finally, what are the decisions that might be happening? It would be really interesting if you could use the participant list and give me a yes or a no. Oh, actually, I think you may not have participants options. No, you may not. Don't worry about that question, but it would be really interesting if you would tell us in chat if there are any other facilitation frameworks you use, because I'm not saying this is the only one. I've really effectively used things like World Cafe, Open Space can work very well online. Appreciative inquiry is another way. I think it's really useful if you can ground yourself within some sort of facilitation structure to help make the design coherent and help to determine the flow. So I encourage you to have a look and see what sorts of things other people are doing in the chat in terms of facilitation methodologies that you found helpful. You will have copies of these slides so you can follow up some of these tips afterwards. So you've got your aims. You've started to work out, you've got some frameworks for design, potentially something like focused conversation, consensus workshop, appreciative inquiry, something like that perhaps. You may at that point have brought in a facilitator who brings their own set of frameworks and tools, but you've got an overall arc or a narrative for your event. Then you get to implementation. And this is where we start getting really creative in terms of how we take our offline activities like post-it exercises, you know, where would a facilitator be without the post-it, and take them into an online environment. So we have two, and there are two kinds of things we're going to be doing, you'd be thinking of then. First of all, what are the exercises? So for instance, we sent you into breakout rooms. That's a technical tool, if you like, but it's also an exercise, just as you might sit people into small groups in a big room. So don't always think about technical solutions, but bear in mind that there are all sorts of amazing technologies out there. I don't expect you to be able to read all of these, but because this is quite an overwhelming slide, it's just basically to illustrate that there is a technology to do pretty much anything you want to do. Have a palette for yourself. Don't try and use all of them, but have a palette that you're really familiar with and fluent with, so that and that covers the range of the different kinds of things you might want to do. So for example, our palette at the moment, we use Basecamp, which is an asynchronous platform. So so for instance, one of the things we try and do is get people to do things outside of the event. For example, in this event, you were asked to provide your challenges well in advance of the meeting. That's an asynchronous sort of out of time activity. And it allowed us to spread beyond the boundaries of the time that we were together. And I find that a really great opportunity if we can do that. And so we quite often use Basecamp or Telegram or WhatsApp to do that. We use Mentimeter and FunRetro. As you've seen with FunRetro, we can leave that running for the rest of the day if we wanted to. We could have started it running last week if we felt so inclined to do so. So there's lots of tools there. Let me find my annotate button, which you can use, not necessarily just in the meeting itself, but actually you could use them asynchronously. I have two platforms I tend to move between for my actual events. I usually use either Zoom or Adobe Connect. Adobe Connect is quite heavy. It's quite bandwidth heavy and needs quite a lot of programming, but it's immensely powerful. Zoom is quick and easy, but actually has very limited functionality, which is why we need to go out to the internet to do a whole load of different things. And then often other facilitators say, you know, how do we do our post-it exercise? How do we get everything on the wall that we do in our meeting rooms, or on the floor, as we may do in certain kinds of research activities? And for those, we use some combination of these three whiteboards. I'm not showing you an example of a whiteboard today, but whiteboards are the way to go in terms of enabling people to do post-it exercises. So that's the sort of, that's the kind of palette I'd be using. I'm just keeping an eye on the time here because I have a tendency to get over enthusiastic and wave my arms around for too long. We cannot emphasize enough that the more experience we've developed in the last decade, the more insistent we are to work with at least one producer, which for me actually is non-negotiable. I won't work with a group of more than 6 people without a producer. And actually, as we start to go up in terms of tens of people, with up to 30 people, I probably would have a second producer. When we've got a very big event, like a couple of hundred, we may have up to 7 people doing a mixture of, for instance, in this event, Helena is doing all the technical side of things, but Rob, I think, is curating and responding and looking at the chat. So we divide the responsibilities between different people. But I think it's something in lots of different domains, especially if we're relatively new in doing it. We kind of think we should be able to do everything ourselves, and if we can't, it's because we're just not good enough. Don't try and do it all yourself. If you're facilitating an event, focus on facilitating. If you're presenting, focus on presenting, and then delegate the other tasks. It will create a much more positive experience for your participants, and actually will create a little bit less stress for you as well, and it will make it run more smoothly. And then we're now getting through really to the detail of implementation. The question, I realize, I think you don't have the check boxes, so the question you're invited to ask is, do you ever use a script yourself if you're doing an event? We had 2 levels of script for today, and I'm sorry I don't have them ready to show in a position where I can show you easily. But we had a sort of a rough running order with some sort of per session, a bit like an agenda, and then we had a very fine script which almost says which slide is happening at which time, which links are being pasted, what the producer is doing, how many people are going to be in the breakouts. So it's a bit like a theatre production at this stage. And it's a really useful way of thinking about it, is actually you are staging something at this level. Not that it should be artificial or that you're an actor, of course not, but actually you will have a stage manager who will produce this and make it happen seamlessly. This script is a script for King Lear, a Shakespearean play, and this shows it, and we do something very similar. So this is where the sound cues, come in, where the electricity LX is lighting. We've got thunder rolls. Okay, so in our virtual events, we don't normally have thunder and lightning, hopefully. Sometimes in South Africa, we lose people because of the thunder and lightning, actually. But the point is that don't leave anything to chance. Don't be trying to make technical decisions on the fly. Having said that, if you've got a detailed script, of course you can improvise. You might move things, you might make things go faster, or you might slow them down, or you might take some questions that take you into a different dimension. And I'm seeing that quite a lot of you already do use this script, so I'm slightly preaching to the converted in this way. But I can't emphasize enough how valuable it is. Okay, and I think I've probably spoken really fast, I'm just going to share something with you for a moment while I pause and just have a quick look at the chat. And I'm going to just very briefly show you something actually that I think is quite cute. When I am sending people on a break, I don't, you have a particular break time activity today. This isn't a break, but I'm just showing you that actually you can do all sorts of interesting things multisensorily by using videos for different functions. So you can help to shape the emotions in the room by creating appropriate videos. So I just wanted to show you that. So I'm going to pause for breath. I'm going to have a look and see what's happening in the chat. I'm going to invite Helena to paste the fun retro in the chat. I'm sorry, I'm slightly discombobulated because I didn't expect to finish so quickly. So we've got lots of time for questions, which is fantastic. The reason we're asking you to add your questions to the Fun Retro board is that it means that I can comment on them later much more easily than I can do in chat. This is a different Fun Retro board, so please do go to that. Please feel free to respond to other people's questions, and we're going to have a Q&A now, but I'm happy for this Q&A to continue asynchronously for the rest of the session, and I will be there answering questions as you go, and you will get a copy of that. So I'm going to take a moment. Rob, is there anything you've been noticing in the chat that you wanted to share with us?
Yeah, thanks, Orla. I would say people seem to be absolutely loving Annotate. Many of them didn't know it was there and are just elated to have discovered it, which is great. A couple of particular questions. One was actually around, you sort of gave us a nice overview of the different sort of platforms and bits of software. This question was about kind of low bandwidth situations, whether there are particular things that you found work better or more stable, particularly for low and middle income countries.
That's a really interesting question, and I'd really like to invite others' responses to that as well. It's an ongoing debate because I'm a researcher as well as a facilitator. This is an ongoing debate. We've stuck with Zoom without video as being the lowest group live method that works. Zoom is more forgiving of bandwidth than other platforms, particularly if you abandon video, which I do very, very rapidly. So Zoom, if you're wanting to try and get a group together with that sense of three-dimensionality, then Zoom. But actually we are exploring using things like some of these tools. So for example, Fun Retro, where you could actually get people without ever connecting them verbally, could actually have them doing something and brainstorming and perhaps chatting on something like WhatsApp. So that's one thing we do. The second thing we do, and this is only appropriate for certain environments and certain mobile phone environments, is that we set up a Zoom meeting, but we really strongly support and invite people to phone into it, because often people have more phone bandwidth and phone data than they have computer data and internet bandwidth. And so you can dial in really easily into a Zoom meeting. Now, I realize that's not appropriate in certain environments where people are working on pay-as-you-go, but it might be easier to support people in terms of giving them phone credit, for instance, or getting them to a place where they could be on a landline potentially, and that will enable them to take part. And that's something I'm not seeing happening as much as I think it should. I see people really struggling online and really struggling with their bandwidth, even in the global north, you know, depending on whether you're in a rural or urban area, depending on whether it's been raining or not. I was in the west of Ireland a couple of weeks ago and bandwidth's not great there, but I'm not seeing people jump into dialing in as quickly as I think they should as a trial. So that would be a long answer to that. The other thing, I think also in my slide, we also use free conference call if we want to properly, if we want to just step outside Zoom altogether. The advantage of using Zoom is that people who do have bandwidth could then maybe jump in. But don't use video. Basically, if some people don't have video, I would say everybody should drop video. That would be a kind of an equity issue.
Great, thank you. One other question that's come up is around where you might go to find more academic work around facilitation methods, such as the focus conversation, as well as actually getting the hints and tips, whether there's a sort of academic corpus of material, I suppose.
I would say on the ICA UK website, which I don't have to hand, but I can possibly drop that into I'll maybe drop it into Fun Retro afterwards. We have a repository of facilitation references there. I have to say, I haven't found a great deal of what I would call academic, as in peer-reviewed facilitation material. Facilitation is a very practical, kind of quite organic field, and there isn't a great deal. There is documentation on focused conversation and consensus workshop, and the link is in, I put it as a footnote in that slide. But in terms of sort of academic and sort of empirically evidence-based work, not a great deal. I'd be really interested to find more, and maybe I haven't looked hard enough.
And that's something we can also pursue a little bit on Mesh as we gather people's suggestions.
Yeah.
We've still got more time for questions and conversation with Orla. I'd invite anyone to continue to put things in the chat. But you can also raise your hand using the Zoom functionality if you want to. If you want to actually put the question yourself, we've got a bit of time for a mix of those things. One slightly sort of more smaller thing, Orla, I know your videos are very popular. Someone was saying, where did you get the ducks video? Was it off YouTube, I think, or the web?
It was, yeah, it's a combination. So I took it, and there are proper credits at the end. I took it from YouTube. YouTube is, there's a whole genre of videos, which are videos to keep your pet happy while you're out of the house. There are videos which are 8 hours long of birds, of ducks, of things that amuse dogs and cats. It's incredible. And so I've used some of those as resources. And I've also taken some scuba diving ones, and they're nice and long, and you can kind of find a segment that works. And what I do is I have one long, peaceful video, usually nature-based. I think it's trying to give people a little bit of a forest bath is lovely, with delicate sound. And then I have a 30. I impose a timer on it, and it's 30 minutes long. But then I can just start at 10 minutes towards the end if it's just a 10-minute break, for example. So it's a single multi-purpose video that I can kind of start or end. I can move the timer so that it's a 15 or 20-minute break if I want. So I make those myself. You can find the timers and the kind of resource material on YouTube, and there are rippers which will enable you to take things down, obviously with full credit, or you could make your own. I'm noticing, let me just think, there's a whole lot of really juicy questions on Fun Retro. I think probably the best thing for me to do is give more comprehensive answers to those later on. But I think there's
a few questions on kind of experiences of different platforms, like someone Rosalind, who's used Teams and found the video breaks quite a lot. And I think that's changing all the time. Different platforms vary, but it's probably worth sharing some of that experience on Mesh as well.
Yes, yeah. I mean, Zoom came to kind of preeminence very fast because the way that and I'm not an engineer and I can't give you a technical definition, but my understanding is both the way in which they compress the data, but also the fact that they have servers dotted right around the world rather than all of them in the US, gives it more of a stability and a kind of a leanness in terms of bandwidth than some other platforms. That's my understanding. Now that may change. Microsoft Teams originated in the US. It's designed for a US style bandwidth, which is limitless 5G bandwidth, really, is the assumption underpinning that. So I particularly in this environment, you're global, you're looking at all sorts of kinds of participants and community-based activities. I think Teams, I'm not sure Teams will ever get the traction because I think Teams is too bandwidth heavy. Having said that, try and make sure people are using a wired connection, try and make sure they turn off everything else, and try and create some risk insurance on your event. Somebody else mentioned that, what if people can't see things? Consider, could people have the slides in advance if they need to do some work? Is there, what sort of things can you do that if people can't be fully present, are there other ways they can connect? And even to the extent of watching it. Even if people are watching a video afterwards, for instance, I would really invite anybody who's watching this on recording, if it's within a day of the event, the Fun Retro board will still be running. So jump in and ask a question and answer a question, So think about ways of stitching people in within their own limitations and plan for it. There is always a question about the extent to which you forge on. If you're going to lose 10% of your participants, will you just forge on or will you plan for it? And it's going to depend a little bit. That's a real equity issue, I think, that needs to be thought about. You might want to do a less ambitious meeting to bring everybody with you.
We have another question, Orla, on sort of data protection and privacy, copyright issues, particularly using a range of these facilitation platforms if you're recording. I don't know whether I've relayed that one correctly from Rosie. But,
it's something that comes up a lot, and I have to confess that I haven't looked into it in an awful lot of detail. I normally will get permission from people before I broadcast anything publicly. and make it really clear that that's what's happening. And I think that probably happened when you registered. And then I think there is something about how long it hangs around as well. I think depending again on the event, if it's sensitive material, you might invite people to rename themselves, maybe with their first names. So there are all sorts of things that you can do to protect privacy. Data protection is around collecting people's personally identifying information. And there are guidelines around that you have to comply with. And that would be not keeping the data for any longer than you need to use it, and not making it available to anybody else. So that's a kind of a crude, relatively amateur answer to that question. But I would say it's really important. Think about it, have a policy, and then stick to the policy with that, and make sure people are giving consent, and that there's an opt-out if they want. Go ahead, Rob.
Sorry, Ola. Just to say that Rachel's added in a few publications on facilitation, which we can add to the list that we might gather. There is a question around facilitation for the visually impaired, who may not be able to use some of the visual functionality. Is that something that you've had experience of, or?
It's something I'm starting to become very interested in. I've got a good friend and colleague who is a consultant in the area of visual impairment and work and business. And he and I have been talking about how to sort of improve the kind of guidance around this. I think the other thing is that that's a very broad church, the issue of visual impairment. If people are profoundly visually impaired and registered, then, quite often they'll have assistive technology, or they may have somebody with them, managing material for them. And so in some ways that's probably not as hard as if people can't see very well but don't necessarily have the technology to read out what's happening, for example. So the short answer is I don't know yet. I think it's a really big area, visual impairment, auditory impairment. And I have to say an awful lot of the work I do is very text-based. And I have a partner who happens to be an expert in literacy challenges, including dyslexia. And I think that's something we need to really start considering. How do we manage for all of those needs? My stock answer to that general question is, if you know in advance what people's challenges are going to be, I always put that in my invitations. Please get in touch with this particular person. It might not be me, if you're going to have challenges. And then actually individuals will very often know very well what they need. So for example, I'm running a training course next week in virtual facilitation, and one of the participants has asked for the materials in advance, and I'm fairly sure I've seen some of her communications. I think she's dyslexic, and so I think she wants to not have to read very fast. So asking in advance means that you will find out, and people then will ideally tell you what they need.
Great, we've got a little bit longer for questions and contributions. If anyone wants to sort of make that contribution themselves, you can raise your hand using the participants tab on Zoom down at the bottom. You've got the option there, I think, to raise a hand, or do add something else in the chat. We've got a few more nice suggestions of different facilitators resources coming in, which is great.
I see, give me a shout if somebody raised their hands. It'd be lovely to hear some other voices, actually. But I'm just cherry picking a few of the fun retro questions. How do you care for people physically? We're all sat at desks and computers. Do you use physical energizers? Absolutely. I haven't used one today because I had a very finite amount of time to work with you all, and maybe, given that we're good for time, we might do a little one before we end. But I always do, and I also try and do things like send people out for walks and get them to come back with photos, depending on the length of the event. I really do. I do some work with some South African colleagues at the Barefoot Guides at CDRA. They're very keen on embodiment as a professional practice, and so we're looking at how to bring that concept into the virtual world. But yeah, remembering we're not just heads on sticks and plugged in microphones. We are entire bodies, and then doing some exercises to enable that to happen is really, really, really important. It's difficult depending on the size of the group. It's kind of hard sometimes to find the right sort of exercise. And also we're wired into these computers if you haven't got Bluetooth headsets. So it's not quite so Not quite so easy to do sometimes, but yes, I do. I haven't done today, and I'm a bit ashamed that I haven't. And I would say also with that, as with everything else, have a repertoire and have it planned in advance. I mean, one of the arts of facilitation is making things look very easy and spontaneous. But I would never, if I was going to want to use energizers, I would have a couple planned already and scheduled as well, because they take a few moments to do. Because you've documented and can continue to document your questions, unless anybody would like to speak, I'm sort of inclined to do an energizer. What do you think, Rob? You're muted, but
so we were heading into a break, but I think yes, why not? Let's do one.
Okay, here's a very simple one, and this would be: you're invited. It's not going to completely humiliate you, but you're very invited to put your videos on. I think you are allowed to do so, and to have your and have a gallery view up so you can see lots of people together. Is that feasible, Helena? Yes, it is. We're seeing lots of people. Okay. And if you can safely stand up without pulling your computer off the table, then do. I'd invite you to use your finger, any finger, to write your name. Write your name in nice big curly writing. If you happen to have a local script like Devanagari or something, that becomes even more interesting. You might be working in a different direction. And once you've done that, write your name with another finger, and that might well be your non-dominant one, and that's going to feel really a little bit strange. Okay. Once you've done that, I then invite you to very gently, so don't waggle your neck, but use your whole head and torso to write your name with your head, with your nose, we'll say, or with your forehead, or with your chin, or with your ear. Go for your surname as well. Gives you a whole body workout. And then I'm going to make it quick because I know we're going into a break. I would then invite you to use either a body part of your choice, or ideally use your hips. And I would like you to use your hips to please write your first name, your birth name, your confirmation name maybe, your surname, and hey, also the name of your first love. How about that? Okay. That wasn't dancing, of course, but give yourself a clap nevertheless. And yeah, a little physical energizer. So I'm listening on Fun Retro. I'll be here for the rest of the conference. I've really enjoyed telling you exciting things. Please keep in touch. Join, link to me on LinkedIn, and let's keep the conversations going. There's huge scope to really improve our practice in this area, and I'm really committed to working with anybody else who's committed to doing it.
Thanks ever so much, Orla, for a great session. And Orla will be staying with us over the next session, so she will still be around. And as she says, be available after to sort of answer questions on Fun Retro. She'll also be helping us curate some resources on Mesh. So we're now going to head into a brief break.
Bác sĩ dặn phải xoay trở và chèn gối giữa hai chân để không bị loét. Giờ mình co duỗi chân nhé. Em thấy có đau không?
Bây giờ 5 giờ sáng rồi, uống thuốc nhé. Ráng ăn đi con, ăn cho đủ chất để nhanh khỏe.
Anh thay tả cho em để em không bị loét và giữ vệ sinh sạch sẽ.
Có ghế bô vệ sinh này, thật là dễ chịu vì không phải dùng tã nữa.
Rầu quá, em không đi được, em không lo cho con được.
Mình ơi, đừng lo lắng, từ từ rồi sẽ khỏe thôi.
Sáng nay con biểu diễn văn nghệ ở trường đó mẹ.
Ồ, vì con mình phải cố gắng. Mong là đi tập thì mình không bị đau nhiều.
Hy vọng việc luyện tập sẽ giúp cho em. Chú Sáu mới chỉ cho anh cách xoa bóp.
Cảm ơn ông xã, bây giờ em cảm thấy thoải mái hơn rồi.
Ôi mệt quá, mình sẽ tiếp tục sau đây.
Anh ba uống tí trà đá cho khỏe.
Cảm ơn anh Dũng nha. Mình sẽ viết ra ai sẽ giúp Mai.
Mình không thích nhờ vả mọi người. Hôm nay mình phải tập. Mình phải tập đứng lên ngồi xuống 20 lần. Giờ thì mình đã sử dụng được nhà vệ sinh này rồi.
Em thử dùng gậy tập đi này.
Phải cố tập đi được 10 mét. Cố lên, mình làm được mà.
Em à, rảnh chiều ghé chơi với anh tí nha. Chị Hoa à, cho vợ em sinh hoạt câu lạc bộ nhé. Bách ơi, anh giúp vợ em tìm việc được không? Vợ em nó thích bánh xèo, chị mua giúp em nhé. Chú Sáu ơi, có nên xoa bóp phần dưới bàn chân vợ con không?
Vui quá, mình lại kiếm được tiền rồi. Ồ, mình thư giãn một lát. Hít vào, thở ra. Giờ mình thấy dễ làm hơn trước rồi.
All of us is traumatized, bro. Essential, the whole world is traumatized because this thing is natural, and it's going out of hand now because there are more numbers. You see.
Ngalolo xesha ndiyazi uba xa ndidibene nomntu okanye umntu endibulisa noba mhlawumbi kukungena kwayo okanye. So ungayazi uba yeyiphi yona nto ofuneke uyenzile. Yona iyoyikisa ngakumbi ke ngoku apha kule ngingqi yam.
Khona le shop apha emall ibivalile kuthiwa umntu ebenayo. To think into yoba ubukhe waya phaya uyazi noba lo mntu kuthiwa benayo mhlawumbi ngulo bekuthengisela. So iyakothusa xa usiva into ezinjalo ngoba siyayazi uba ikhona yona qha ke kuba singaba bantu sicinga into yoba ayinandifumana mna.
That's why ke ngosithi thina since uba thina sibadala asifuni kwamntu ungena apha kuthi eyadini. Ubiyangena mayingene ngolo hlobo iyangena ngalo kuthi.
Impilo ayintlanga kuba kaloku awuzenzi izinto njengesiqhelo. Uthuka rhoqo uba kanene funeke ndihlamba izandla, kanene ngoku kufuneke ndingabambi intsimbi. Umzekelo igeyithi sibamba sibaninzi kuba sibaninzi apha eyadini. So xa uphuma egeyithini funeka uyazi uba ndibamba laa geyithi, andimazi lo bebambe phaa kulaa geyithi. So ngalo lonke xesha uthi ngoba sowuphumile endlini funeka uphinde ujike uyothatha into ozothi wosule okanye usanitize. So iyayitshintsha kakhulu, itshintshile impilo yam kakhulu.
So yona iyoyikisa ngoba awuyazi yona ndawo ikuyo. Betere i-AIDS yona uyayazi uba uyifumana njani. Le ungayaziyo noba ucokola nomntu soyisulelekile ngayo and iteksi ukhwela iteksi ubamba icango leteksi uyosuleleka. So ukukufa yiyo eyona nto indoyikisayo ngoba ingathi buye sonyuka abantu abafayo every day, inani liyenyuka.
Makuvalwe tu ke ngoku abantu bahlala ezindlini nabantu like abantu abasokolayo bancedakale kuba kuyo yonke le nto kukho abantu abangaphangeliyo, abanye abangazifumaniyo nezo grosali, abangazifumaniyo nezo nto nezo mali kuthiwa ziyakhutshwa. Abantu bayasokola. Mna uba angenza ezo nto ebantwini kulandelelwe kujongwa abantu uba bayazifumana iinto ofuneka bezifumene nezinto ekufuneka zenziwe ziyenziwe kuba ke yona le into isenza buhlungu.
Akuncedanga uba kuvalwe kwiindawo ezithile but kwiindawo ezithile kuvulwe. because abantu banechance ke ngoku yoya kwezaa ndawo kuthiwa mazivuli. Kulapho ke ngoku abantu badibana khona. And bekufanele into yoba nezi food parcels xa zikhutshwayo kuchazwe kwa abantu befowunelwa, kuchazwe kuthiwa kufunwa inani elithile. Ingabi ngulaa mdilili omnye semva komnye phaa. Abayinikana abantu laa distance kuthiwa mabayenze. Abayenzi abantu loo nto leyo. Kuthiwa imask, once uyithenga imask kuyanyanzeleka into yoba imask uyihlambe kuqala phambi uyifake ebusweni bakho. But ke ngoku kunabantu abathengisa iimaski kwezaa ndawo abantu bayokhangela khona ukutya. But aba bantu ngoku umntu uyithenga ngoku imask ayifake ngoku kuye. And akumazi ke ngoku umntu ebesenza laa mask uba ukweyiphi imeko yena. Abanye abantu ufumanisa into yoba unayo imask kodwa akayifakanga kwezi ndawo bekuthiwe makukhuselwe kuzo. Imask ayizukunceda ngosuke ube nayo uyifake entanyeni uyeke uvala impumlo nomlomo.
Trời, ngài biết nói hả?
Chú mới bán thuốc kháng sinh colistin cho ông chủ tụi con phòng bệnh thương hàn trên gà đúng không?
Tụi con còn nhỏ, còn yếu lắm. Phải dùng kháng sinh phòng bệnh chứ.
Tụi con không yếu đâu, chỉ là đi từ trại gà giống tới hộ nuôi, đường xa nên tụi con hơi mệt thôi à. Ăn uống nghỉ ngơi đầy đủ là khỏe liền.
Nhưng trước giờ bà con quen dùng kháng sinh phòng bệnh rồi. Người ta đòi mua chẳng lẽ chú không bán?
Chú có thể tư vấn phòng bệnh bằng cách khác mà, như khử trùng kỹ chuồng trước khi bắt gà về, chọn giống khỏe như tụi con nè, hay là đảm bảo thức ăn, nước uống sạch và nhiệt độ vừa phải.
Học thuộc lòng ở đâu ra vậy nhỏ?
Nè chú.
Ủa, có điện thoại luôn.
Còn có Facebook nữa nè.
Dự án Vi Bắc từ đơn vị nghiên cứu lâm sàng Đại học Oxford khuyến cáo như vậy đó chú.
Cái đó ở bên Tây mà.
Ở Việt Nam, Bộ Nông nghiệp và Phát triển Nông thôn cũng đang tiến tới loại bỏ việc sử dụng kháng sinh trong phòng bệnh cho động vật từ năm 2020 kìa chú.
Tổ chức Y tế Thế giới cũng khuyến cáo không được dùng kháng sinh phòng bệnh cho động vật nữa. Chú nói một tiếng với ông chủ tụi con nha.
Chú biết rồi.
Gà khỏe, không cần kháng sinh.